My family tried to force me out of my own home, so I taught them a lesson they'll never forget. I never imagined I'd become that person, the one whose own family would treat me like a cash register with a heartbeat, using me as their personal ATM while I slogged through endless hospital shifts. But here I am. My name is Ava, I'm 34, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one who holds everything together. Losing my father at a young age meant that I was forced into a role I never asked for, one where my mother, stepfather, and younger half-siblings, Lena, 27, and Ryan, 24, relied on me for support, both emotionally and financially. I worked long, grueling shifts as a nurse, pouring every spare penny into keeping our fractured little family afloat. I believed that if I could shoulder the burden, I could keep us all from falling apart. One particularly brutal night, after a 16-hour shift that left me numb and barely able to think, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. I was so exhausted that I answered it without a second thought. On the other end, Lena's voice came through, laughing, mocking, and far from the comforting tone I needed. I could barely catch her words over the ambient clink of glasses and the low hum of chatter that hinted at an upscale restaurant setting. As I listened, every syllable cut deeper. They were out celebrating at a fancy establishment, using my hard-earned money as if it were an endless resource. "She's so pathetic," Lena jeered. "She thinks she's helping us, but really she's just our ATM with no personality." My mother's voice joined in with a condescending laugh, and Ryan's dismissive snicker echoed in the background. In that moment, everything shifted. I realized with a shock so fierce it nearly paralyzed me that I was nothing more than a tool to them, a resource to be exploited without remorse. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding, as the truth sank in. My family had been manipulating me for years. All those sacrifices, all those long nights, were never acts of love, they were demands. I had been the glue that held them together, and yet they never cared about my well-being. I was invisible until I was needed, and then discarded once I could no longer serve their endless greed. Tears threatened to fall, but I swallowed them down and forced myself to listen, even as every word felt like a betrayal. That phone call, that cruel dinner conversation I wasn't meant to hear, marked the beginning of something new, a slow, burning determination to reclaim my life. I realized that I had been too willing to say yes, too eager to please, and it was time to change everything. I resolved then and there that I would no longer be their doormat. I would no longer allow myself to be drained for their convenience. I was about to embark on a journey toward freedom, empowerment, and ultimately, revenge. And it started with reclaiming my dignity, one painful truth at a time. In the days that followed that fateful phone call, I tried to maintain my usual routine at the hospital, but the images and voices of that night haunted me. Every time my phone buzzed with a call from home, I braced myself for another dose of their entitled demands. Then one afternoon, as I finally sat down to catch my breath between patients, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Logging into my email to check on some financial matters, I uncovered a loan document with my name on it, a loan I never authorized. My heart pounded as I read through the details. The loan had been taken out by my stepfather, and its staggering sum was already wreaking havoc on my credit score. I remembered Lena's derisive words. "She's too desperate to feel needed. She won't stop helping." And Ryan's offhand comment, "She'll pay off the debt when she finds out. She won't ruin her credit over this." My mother's voice had been even more unyielding. "She owes us. She's got no kids, no man. What else does she do with her money?" In that moment, it all became painfully clear. I wasn't loved by my family. I was exploited, used as an endless resource to fund their whims and cover their failures. The loan was just one more piece of the puzzle, a symbol of their utter disregard for my well-being. I sat in stunned silence, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me. I couldn't believe that the person I'd trusted to care for me had taken such a huge risk with my future. My credit score, my financial security, everything I'd worked so hard to build was now hanging by a thread because of their selfishness. And yet, even as anger bubbled up inside me, I found myself unable to confront them directly. I continued to take their calls, answer their messages, and even meet with them when necessary, all while silently planning my next move. One evening, as I trudged home from another grueling shift, I received a text that made my blood run cold. My landlord was raising the rent again. According to the message, the increase was necessary due to rising operational costs, a common excuse. But deep down, I knew the real reason. My family's unrelenting demands and insatiable greed were pushing them to expect more from me. My mother's message was sweet and insistent. "Ava, we need your help. The rent's gone up, and you're the only one who can fix this." I forced a smile as I replied, "Of course, I'll handle it," even though every fiber of my being screamed that enough was enough. That night, while lying awake in my tiny apartment, I began to piece together the patterns of their manipulation. I compiled every fraudulent charge, every unauthorized withdrawal, and every deceitful text message into a growing dossier of evidence. The realization that they had never loved me, they had only ever used me, ignited a fierce determination within me. I vowed to play along until I had everything I needed to break free, to confront them with every lie they had told, every ounce of betrayal they had inflicted upon me. I knew it was only a matter of time before their next demand came, and I prepared myself to face it with a calm facade while secretly planning my escape. Deep inside, the thought of reclaiming my dignity and independence filled me with a quiet but relentless fire. I was done being the sacrificial lamb, done being the invisible safety net that everyone took for granted. I was preparing for the day when I would finally say, "No more," and watch as they crumbled under the weight of their own greed. For weeks, I maintained the outward appearance of compliance. I answered every call with a polite, tired "yes, Mom," and I continued to help with bills and other trivial matters, all the while my mind was racing with plans of retribution. I acted as if nothing had changed, all while secretly orchestrating my escape from this toxic cycle. Then, one day, the inevitable happened. I received a call from my landlord informing me of yet another rent increase. "It's due to rising costs," he explained. But I knew the truth. This was just another way for my family to squeeze more money out of me. As soon as I hung up, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother, full of her usual sugary reassurances. "Ava, we really need your help this month. We can't manage the extra cost on our own." I replied with a measured, "Of course," my voice calm and collected, even though my heart was pounding with anticipation. That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, I began to lay out my plan. I meticulously organized every piece of evidence. Screenshots of fraudulent loan applications, text messages where they mocked my willingness to help, and the rent increase notice. I knew that if I could just let them believe I was still the obedient, self-sacrificing daughter, I could then use their own greed and entitlement against them. I continued to engage with them as usual in the following days, nodding along to their pleas and offering words of reassurance. But beneath that facade, I was preparing for the moment when I would have had enough. Every call they made, every text they sent, every demand for more money only added fuel to the fire that was quietly building within me. I began to realize that the longer I waited, the more evidence I would have, and the more devastating my eventual confrontation would be. Secretly, I started to explore my options. I looked into legal advice, checking what rights I had regarding the unauthorized loan and the misappropriation of my emergency fund, a fund that was meant to protect me in times of real need. I discovered that I had every right to cut them off financially and legally, and that knowledge empowered me even further. I vowed that when the time came, I would expose every single lie, every deceitful act, and let them face the consequences of their actions. I let them believe that I was still their compliant daughter, one who would always find a way to fix everything. I smiled at their incessant messages and answered their desperate phone calls with the same tired politeness I had always known. But behind closed doors, I was building a fortress of evidence and planning my final act of defiance. I would let the rent deadline pass without my payment, and I would watch as they scrambled, desperate and helpless, to mend the mess they had created. The calm before the storm was a bittersweet time. Every minute that ticked by brought me closer to the moment of reckoning. I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, knowing that soon I would reclaim my power and finally put an end to the years of exploitation. I was preparing not only to walk away, but to leave them drowning in the wreckage of their own making. The final straw came on a cold, sleepless night when I discovered that my mother had cashed out my emergency fund without my knowledge. A fund I had painstakingly built up as a safety net for genuine emergencies. Instead, she used that money to indulge in frivolous luxuries and to prop up Sean's irresponsible lifestyle. I felt as if the ground had been pulled from beneath my feet. That was the moment when everything inside me shattered, and I knew I could no longer remain silent. On the day the increased rent was due, my phone exploded with frantic messages from my family. "Ava, we need you now," pleaded Lena, while Ryan's texts were filled with panicked demands. "Pay the rent, or we're all in trouble." I sat in silence, my face a mask of calm indifference as I let the chaos wash over me. Instead of sending the payment, I did nothing. By midnight, the flood of calls and texts became unbearable. I finally picked up my phone and, with a steady, almost cold voice, I confronted them. "I know everything," I said. "I heard every single word that night. I know about the loan taken out in my name, and I know about the emergency fund you cashed out without my permission." There was a long pause, and then Lena's voice, usually so full of condescension, trembled as she tried to form a response. Ryan's voice cracked as he mumbled something about how things would be fine, but I wasn't having any of it. I continued, "You have taken everything from me, my money, my trust, and my dignity. I am done being your safety net. I'm done funding your selfish lifestyle." I laid bare every deceitful act they had committed, every fraudulent charge, and every lie they had told. I declared that I would no longer cover the rent or support their reckless spending. My tone was calm, but every word dripped with the finality of my decision. The conversation escalated quickly. My mother's voice turned from pleading to shrill indignation, while Lena's bitterness filled the air with accusations that I was ungrateful. Ryan's attempts to defend them only made things worse. I ended the call without waiting for a response, leaving them in stunned silence. I then sent a group message that simply read, "I'm cutting you all off, effective immediately." That single message marked the end of my era as their sacrificial lamb. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, feeling a mixture of sorrow, anger, and an overwhelming sense of liberation. I had done it. I had finally taken back control of my life. I had exposed their greed and manipulation, and now I could only wait to see the consequences unfold. Deep down, I knew that letting the rent deadline pass without my payment would force them to face the reality of their actions. And as the hours ticked by in the eerie silence of that night, I felt a strange sense of calm. I was no longer their doormat. I was finally free. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Within hours of my confrontation, my phone was inundated with messages and frantic calls from my family, all begging, threatening, and guilt-tripping me. "Ava, please," my mother's texts pleaded, dripping with false tears. "We're your family. Don't abandon us now." My father's voice in a voicemail was laced with thinly veiled threats, reminding me that I owed them, that I should be ashamed of my actions. Ryan's messages were desperate, and Lena's texts tried to gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting. Yet I remained unmoved. I had set my boundaries, and there was no going back. As the day wore on, the reality of their situation began to sink in. News came that eviction notices had been served to Sean and Ashley. Without my support, their financial safety net had evaporated, and the landlord was threatening to take drastic measures. The family's panic grew palpable. I received one final desperate message from Ryan. "Ava, we're running out of time. Please, we need you now." I looked at it with a cold, detached satisfaction. They had finally reached the point where they had to face the consequences of their greed. Later that afternoon, Sean's phone call came through. His voice, usually filled with arrogance, was now tinged with anger and desperation. "Ava, you have to reconsider," he shouted. "You're our only hope. If you don't help, we're all going to lose everything." For a split second, I almost felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned by the realization that I had been used for far too long. I replied firmly, "I'm not your safety net anymore, Sean. This is your problem to solve." His voice faltered, but he continued to plead, trying to twist my words into some semblance of guilt. Meanwhile, Ashley sent a text in a tone that mixed regret with victimhood. "I never meant for it to go this far, Ava. Please don't do this." But I had made up my mind. I sat back and watched as they scrambled to resolve the mess they had created. Every frantic call and desperate text served as a reminder of the years I had spent sacrificing my own happiness. The chaos around me was the natural consequence of their entitlement. I no longer had any responsibility for their failures. The burden had shifted entirely onto them. I left their messages unanswered, each one a testament to their crumbling world. The evictions were now inevitable, and I could almost hear the sound of their frantic footsteps as they realized there was no rescue coming from me. My heart felt strangely light amid the devastation, and though I knew this was a painful moment for them, it was the only way they could finally learn that they could no longer take advantage of my generosity. The final confirmation came early one morning. The landlord had officially evicted Sean, Ashley, and the rest of my family from the rental home they had been living in. The eviction was final, and for the first time in my life, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I wasn't celebrating their misery, but I was celebrating my freedom. I had finally broken the chains that had bound me to their endless demands. In the weeks that followed, I took decisive steps to rebuild my life. I changed my phone number, closed the joint accounts my parents had shamelessly maintained in my name, and transferred all my funds into a new account solely under my control. I found a new apartment in a different city, a modest, sunlit space that I could call my own without the constant reminder of my past exploitation. Packing my belongings felt like shedding layers of an old life that no longer served me. Every box sealed was a small victory over the years of self-sacrifice and manipulation. My new apartment was a sanctuary of quiet independence. The familiar hum of the city outside replaced the incessant noise of family demands, and I finally had the space to breathe and think. In the stillness of that new environment, I began to rediscover who I was beyond the role of caretaker. I decorated carefully, choosing pieces that resonated with my newfound sense of self-worth. Every corner of my apartment reflected the promise of a future that was mine alone. A future unburdened by the endless demands of those who had only ever seen me as a resource. As days turned into weeks, the old guilt and sorrow that had once weighed heavily on my shoulders began to dissipate. I no longer felt the sting of their betrayal as acutely. Instead, I embraced the liberation that came with cutting ties. I even found solace in the silence of my phone, free from desperate messages and incessant calls. I could finally sleep soundly, knowing that I was no longer responsible for mending a broken family that never truly cared about me. Sometimes, late at night, as I lay in my new bed listening to the gentle murmur of the city, I would reflect on everything that had transpired. I recalled the endless shifts at the hospital, the humiliation at that luxury restaurant, the bitter sting of the unauthorized loan, and the final, shattering betrayal of the cashed-out emergency fund. Each memory, once a source of pain, had now become a stepping stone on my journey to self-empowerment. I began to understand that the best revenge isn't a fight. It isn't about inflicting pain or making them suffer. True revenge is in the quiet dignity of walking away, in reclaiming your life and letting those who took you for granted drown in the mess they created. I no longer harbored anger or bitterness. I felt only a profound relief. I had taken back my power, and that was worth more than any reconciliation or apology ever could be. In the months that followed, I built a life that was entirely my own. I flourished in my career, made new friends who valued me for who I was, and even began to explore hobbies I had long abandoned. Every day I felt lighter, more in control of my destiny. My journey wasn't just about escaping a toxic family. It was about finding myself in the process of liberation and learning to value my own happiness above all else. Standing by the window of my new apartment one bright morning, I looked out at the horizon and whispered to myself, "The best revenge isn't a fight. It's walking away and letting them drown in the mess they created." In that moment, I truly believed it. I had no regrets, only the sweet, unyielding satisfaction of knowing I was finally free. I was free from the burden of others' expectations, free from the manipulation, and most importantly, free to live life on my own terms.